of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Good evening. It's an honour and a privilege to have you with me. Welcome along to Neil Oliver Live on GB News TV and on radio. Tonight on the show, I'll be speaking to former presenter Steve Miller about his family's experience with government-regulated care homes during the pandemic. We'll catch up with a 67-year-old shopkeeper who locked a shoplifter in his store only to be told by police to release the crook or face prosecution himself. We'll find out how a naughty spaniel rejected by 8 different homes ultimately managed to land himself a job saving lives. He's now one of the most successful medical detection dogs in Britain, sniffing out the likes of cancer, malaria and COVID-19. What a good boy. All of that and more coming up. But first, an update on the latest news from Aaron Armstrong.
Hi there, Aaron Armstrong here in the GB newsroom. The Duke of Sussex says he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following Princess Diana's death. In a live-streamed interview with trauma specialist Dr Gabor Mate, the Duke of Sussex discussed living with loss and personal healing. Prince Harry says he doesn't see himself as a victim and doesn't want sympathy. He has compared himself to Princess Diana in feeling different from the rest of the family, and says he tries to constantly show love and affection to his children in contrast to his father, King Charles. New messages involving Matt Hancock reveal how the former Health Secretary battled to save his job after footage of him embracing colleague Gina Colandangelo emerged during lockdown. The pictures clearly showed Hancock breaking social distancing rules. A string of messages published in the Daily Telegraph illustrates how Hancock explored a series of explanations to justify his behaviour in an attempt to manage the crisis and save his career. Hancock initially wanted to claim no rules were broken, then decided to apologise for breaking lockdown guidance before tendering his resignation 2 days later. Boris Johnson may be facing a fight to save his political career following the findings of a report into Partygate. The Commons Privileges Committee investigating his conduct say there's significant new evidence that Boris Johnson misled MPs over lockdown parties on several occasions, and it would have been obvious to him and his colleagues they were breaking the rules. Mr Johnson says it was his belief all guidance had been followed. Charlie Rowley, a former special advisor to Michael Gove, told us Partygate is still a distraction for the government, who should be focusing on things that really matter.
This is why, on the back of the inquiry that published their pre-report yesterday, on the back of messages that we're seeing leaked to the Telegraph that involved the former Health Secretary and the appointment of Sue Gray to the Labour Party as Chief of Staff to Sir Keir Starmer, I think this is why Labour will be happy for the country to be talking about Partygate again, because it is a distraction from allowing the government to tell the public and to deliver on what really matters to people, and that's education in the health service. It's stopping the small boats. It's getting the economy back on track.
New powers to crack down on small boats crossing the Channel are expected to be announced by the government next week. The legislation is expected to make asylum claims inadmissible from those who travel to the UK on small boats, as well as banning migrants from returning once removed. And those arriving would be removed as soon as reasonably practically possible. That includes anyone arriving on a small boat should be moved to Rwanda or a safe third country. The Prime Minister has vowed to stop the boats as one of his 5 priorities. Thousands of elderly people have died as a result of not getting proper care. That's according to the charity Age UK. It's deeply concerned by NHS figures, which show almost 29,000 requests for people aged 65 and over to be given support in the year 2021 to 22, were in fact recorded as them having died without any services being provided. The charity says the figures amount to more than 550 deaths per week, or 79 per day. The Health Department says it's providing up to £7.5 billion of funding over the next 2 years to support adult social care. The number of people killed by a Russian strike in the southern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia has risen to 11. Emergency services say they recovered a woman's body in the debris this morning. A child was amongst those killed in Thursday's strike on a 5-storey residential building. The President, Volodymyr Zelensky, has vowed to hold Moscow accountable, saying evil will not reign in our land. The UK is in for a cold snap next week, with temperatures expected to drop below freezing. Monday and Tuesday will see lows of -3 in Scotland and -2 in the northwest and the east of England. Yellow weather warnings for snow and ice will be in place from early Monday to late Tuesday across northern Scotland and north-east England. The Met Office says the conditions are likely to cause some disruption to travel, as well as power outages. TV online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Neil Oliver Live.
I'm telling you now, if you're still getting your latest news from the traditional mainstream media, then it's not news. It's not investigation in search of the truth. As far as I'm concerned, it's a limp attempt by outfits compromised by complicity with years of misuse of the people, desperate to find a quiet off-ramp from the road to hell they've been enthusiastically barrelling along. Even now, with everyone getting so excited watching rats running for the lifeboats, the mainstream media is still working within the same old narrative, still talking about masks for school children and testing for COVID-19, still asking the questions we already know the answers to. How can it be that after all this time, the mainstream media is still failing to ask the most important questions about so much that happened? After all this time, how can they still miss the open goal so completely? A person might say it's down to more of that good old willful blindness. After all, for the vast majority of the mainstream media, they're looking at journalistic credibility as a vanishing dot in the rearview mirror. Having spent the past 2 and more years performing as unquestioning foghorns for the government narrative, the time for them to remember that the job of the Fourth Estate is to challenge authority is long, long past, never to be regained. Give the devils their due. All those years, the years of the bungs from the hundreds of millions of pounds spent by the government and Bill Gates and others to ensure a warm welcome and happy hosting for the official narrative of lockdowns and masks saving lives, of safe and effective medical procedures and all that jazz, were surely enough to leave many so-called news organisations punch drunk and suffering double or even triple vision when it came to keeping a beady eye on that pesky matter of the truth. And still, after all the demonstrable catastrophic harms of lockdown, after all those lives and livelihoods ruined, all those dodgy contracts, the greatest transfer of wealth in history from the poor to the billionaires, the excess deaths mounting and as unexplained as ever, after all that, and in lieu of real investigation, we get speculation about whether Matt Hancock ordered enough tests before sending the elderly into care homes, about who did or didn't want to close schools. Is that really the best they can do? Let's once again, once more and with feeling, contemplate some of the list of questions so many journalists still won't ask. The answers we can only assume they simply don't care to hear. If the politicians were so scared in the face of the images coming out of China in 2019, then why didn't they listen objectively and reasonably to all of the science? What about the Great Barrington Declaration? Instead of ignoring all those experts and dismissing their appeal for another way of handling things, might it not have been appropriate to listen and ask questions? And what about the doctors all around the world who examined their patients with COVID-19, recognised it as a respiratory virus and quickly identified cheap, readily available and effective ways to treat them? During the first part of 2020, in the US, in Europe and in Africa, doctors were treating their patients in the way they're supposed to, which is to say, looking at the person in front of them and addressing the symptoms with on-label and off-label medicines with tried and tested safety records and proof of efficacy. Those doctors were sharing information with anyone who would listen, trying, mostly in vain, to publish scientific papers detailing their findings in supposedly serious medical journals about how their treatments were saving thousands of lives without hospitalisation and in advance of any so-called vaccines. But instead of listening to them, instead of taking them seriously, or at least asking questions, governments in those countries and around the world and the play-along mainstream media went out of their way to ridicule and ban those medicines, to strike off those doctors and to shut down and censor anyone at all from so much as talking about them. Where was the Telegraph newspaper and the rest of the mainstream media when all that was going on? Where were the questions about whether or not COVID-19 was readily treatable with available drugs? What was on the front pages then? Lockdown and face masks for all, Scotch eggs, one-way paths round supermarkets and the rule of 6, the nonsense and fear porn that ruined us. That's what. If governments and the mainstream media following the science, as they called it, were so desperate to fight COVID-19, then why did they silence experienced and highly credentialed medical professionals with potentially life-saving information to offer? Why is it still to this day close to forbidden to talk about drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine? Why are the vast majority of the world's populations still kept in the dark about how many doctors saw at once that apart from anything else, they were dealing with a respiratory virus and knew from the medical training all doctors receive that a respiratory virus like COVID-19 was to be treated with available antiviral drugs, with anti-inflammatory drugs, and when things got more serious, with antithrombotic drugs? Why was that not a conversation on every front page? On this show, I interviewed Dr. Shankara Chetty from South Africa, who personally treated thousands of COVID patients with, among other available on-label medicines, antihistamines, and saved all those lives without hospitalisation. Dr. Chetty was invited to Malaysia to share his knowledge, and doctors there, following his protocol, saved many thousands more lives. He was the recipient of an award from the Malaysian government for his efforts. Why didn't we hear about him here? Why weren't the mainstream media asking about his successful life-saving efforts? I've spoken at length with Dr. Pierre Corey, an esteemed critical care physician in the US, one of many who advocated the use of off-label medicines for COVID-19. Why was he bluntly shut down instead of being listened to? Where were the investigative journalists to objectively investigate what he was saying? Front pages and chatter now about whether or not Matt Hancock bothered to ensure enough testing of the elderly before they entered care homes. That's not the question. The question is, how were the elderly with COVID actually treated in those care homes? Indeed, how exactly were people with COVID treated in hospitals and elsewhere? Was it the right treatment? That is a crucial question that still goes unasked. And why did so many people die here in this country when patients under the care of doctors like Shankara Chetty and Pierre Corey recovered without the need of going to hospital? Why don't we know more about all of this? Another doctor or scientist might say treatment with those off-label and on-label antiviral drugs, anti-inflammatories and antithrombotics and antihistamines posed risks. Maybe so, but risks were also posed by the so-called vaccines and other new products like remdesivir that were available later in the pandemic. Research carried out by Pfizer made plain the company was well aware in advance of the rollout of the risk of adverse effects related to their so-called vaccines. And yet governments around the world indemnified those makers, which is to say those governments accepted that if any harm was done to people, resulting in the need for compensation, then the taxpayers would foot the bill. Why so ready to take risks with so-called vaccines and to wash the hands of the makers in advance when it came to experimental gene therapies labelled as vaccines, but an outright ban on using existing drugs with decades of proven safety and efficacy? Why? And most importantly right now, in the context of supposed revelations about what went on in care homes, why are so many journalists still not asking those same straightforward questions? Why were elderly people in care homes suffering with COVID and having breathing difficulties given opiates and benzodiazepines? Those patients had a respiratory virus. Might they not have got better if treated with other drugs? And here's another question for the mainstream media. The so-called vaccines are quietly being withdrawn as well. Have you noticed? Why is that? when, according to a headline in The Lancet on the 14th of January this year, the COVID pandemic is far from over. If the pandemic is far from over and the so-called vaccines are the best answer, as we are told over and over, where have those products gone? And why no investigation of that by journalists? If they were safe and effective for the under-50s a few weeks and months ago, why are they no longer available for that age group now? Surely that's an interesting development. Why aren't we hearing more about it? Seems to me we're being prescribed something else now, a giant dose of amnesia. After 3 years of catastrophic harms to ways of life, to economies, to children, apparently it's now time to forget so much of what happened, or at least to consign it all to history. After all, nowadays we've got war, climate crisis, and 15-minute cities and drag queen story time to contemplate on a round-the-clock basis. There's to be a COVID inquiry. Of course there is. I wonder which company will get the contract for all the whitewash. What's happening now is spectacularly unedifying. All manner of characters suddenly keen to talk about Matt Hancock and tests and face masks, not to mention millions of words of WhatsApp messages, are the same ones that for months on end bellowed about locking down earlier, harder and for longer, the same ones that wanted a mask on every face, including those of children and infants, the same that wanted mandated injections with those new medical products, the same ones that celebrated the need to cancel Christmas before jetting off to enjoy their holidays in Antigua or the Med, the same ones that took to writing miles of newspaper columns about how those law-abiding, tax-paying fellow citizens, preferring, as was their right, not to receive those medical products, should face all manner of punishment, consequences and retribution. Those same characters, in print and on screen, are suddenly positioning themselves to celebrate the downfall of the very people whose draconian, unlawful, shameful actions they were such hearty cheerleaders for just 5 minutes ago. But if they've got selective memories, then thankfully millions of us do not. We remember every word, tweet and moment of screen time. Better yet, we kept the receipts. Every bug-eyed, white-lipped call for lockdown. Every feverish demand to see the so-called COVIDiots, granny killers, COVID deniers and anti-vaxxers locked up or worse. It's all still there. A permanent record of what I would describe as the most shameful dereliction of duty by any generation of so-called journalists. It's well known and admitted that the population of this country was subjected to propaganda and psychological manipulation. Let's have some questions about why that happened. In my opinion, lockdowns caused untold damage and were a mistake. We know now that the masks were pointless, even the much vaunted N95s. Why aren't we asking questions about that? Who decided the people should be stifled, our questions and dissent silenced and brainwashed instead? We must remember that that's what happened and demand to know why. And here's the thing, if we were manipulated, silenced and censored to stop us asking questions about COVID-19, why should we think for 1 minute that those same characters are telling us the truth about anything else? About the war in Ukraine, about climate, about digital IDs and central bank digital currencies, about the compromised World Health Organization? Will we go along with plans to let the WHO call the next pandemic and lay down the laws we'll all be ordered to obey? Is that another so-called conspiracy theory? You know, the sort of conspiracy theory that comes true eventually, like so many others. Why aren't they asking questions about all of this? Because we are. As the saying goes, after all, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. That's my opinion. Of course it is, and you're free to disagree with me. Keep your tweets and emails coming all through the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk and you can tweet me as well at gbnews, and I'll try to get to some of your comments later in the show. I'm joined by filmmaker and director of the education charity World Right, Kerry Dingle, and podcaster and education specialist Tom Buick. Welcome both. Always good to see both of you. Kerry, why did so many people become so compliant, so unquestioning?
Well, it's interesting, actually, because, you know, people are going to now start talking about a COVID inquiry, but we've seen this before. You know, Hillsborough, the lies about Hillsborough, it took 20 years for an inquiry to tell us what we already knew. And I think we are seeing what we already knew. Lockdown was carnage in so many ways. But I think there's a broader problem of conformism and fear of questioning things. And I think we should be careful not to just blame the messenger. You know, you talk about mainstream media. Well, GB News is part of mainstream media. I would find
questions.
But that's the great thing about GB News is you can ask questions, and people like you are on there, and people like me are on there. I think even YouTube has joined mainstream media on so many ways. Facebook, the kind of when I made a film called Spreaders about the vilification of young people as spreaders, every time that trailer went up, you'd get a COVID health warning with it. Every time I questioned climate change, I'm called a denier, and a redirection to a government site on climate change comes up. So there is a culture of conformism. Everyone looks over their shoulder at Ofcom. There is fear. People do get cancelled, and I understand that. But I think where we can, we have to ask big questions, and you do that. Having said that, I don't think that there was some great prejudice against repurposing existing cheap drugs like ivermectin.
You couldn't mention their names.
No, you couldn't. It came to a certain point where that was vilified too. And it's very weird, and I'm interested to know why. Why was something like ivermectin something that on one side, those who were very sceptical, rightly sceptical of lockdown, suddenly latched onto ivermectin as a big cure. And on the other side, those who were for government policy, ivermectin was the demon that couldn't be spoken about. So it's interesting that a drug becomes a political focal point.
Well, couldn't it have
I don't think it either had the answers, and it certainly should have been discussed.
Is it unconnected to the fact that because ivermectin was beyond patent restrictions and could be produced cheaply by any generic manufacturer, a course of ivermectin cost $2 for the World Health Organization. Remdesivir, which was brought in as a kind of ivermectin 2.0, which has its own question marks hanging over it about safety, is $3,000 a course. Now, I just say follow the money.
Well,
when you ask the question, why was one shut down and the other was promoted?
Well, we had that with the AIDS drugs, though. We had that. Once they come out of patent and that had been challenged,
Tom,
people were able to... And I don't think we should just assume cheap is good. Although you're not wrong, some of the drugs are ludicrous pricing. But I don't think we should assume that cheap and available is necessarily where it's at.
Tom, how do we inspire your education? You're a very positive, forward-looking person. How do we inspire people that they have the power and the obligation and the responsibility to ask questions? It's a positive thing to do.
Absolutely. It's great to see Kerry providing the challenge back to your monologue this evening. You saved me the job there. But look, I mean, the Exocet missile of truth tonight, Neil, in your monologue, actually, is the dangers of groupthink. I mean, you're seeing it in spades when you look at these WhatsApp messages. I think I'll avoid for now talking about the cesspit of narcissism that runs like a golden thread through a lot of it. But I think the danger here, and we've all got to accept this, that this virus breaks out in, just so happens, in authoritarian China. Interestingly, the CIA now have come out and said that the likely leak for this virus came from the National Virology Centre in Wuhan. Remember, anyone who suggested that was put up in lights as a conspiracy theorist. Now we've got the Central Intelligence Agency saying that. That's why I refer to your monologue as a Exocet missile of truth, because I think what you're exposing here this evening, and we all need to, anyone that's involved in the media, in public policy, in positions of leadership. Look, I had this as an educationalist having to deal with the Department for Education around the cancellation of exams. My instinct was actually, given that, for example, Ireland went ahead with physical examinations, actually some parts of Germany went ahead with some physical examinations, I pushed back on that at the time with some of the big decision makers. But, whoa, it was made very clear to me that when dealing with the Department for Education and with Number 10, that was not the accepted narrative, that wouldn't be a particular career-enhancing move for Tom Buick. And I think we've all got caught up in the maelstrom, frankly, of that kind of groupthink, and that's something we need to challenge going forward.
Absolutely. I'm being told that we're already minutes behind schedule. That's how fast it happens to be. So we've got a break coming now, after which I'll be speaking to the former presenter, Steve Miller, about his family's very sad and personal experience of care home visiting guidelines during the pandemic.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView, Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. As I said in my monologue, I maintain that questions remain to be asked about what actually happened to people in care homes with COVID-19. I believe we are obliged to ask questions if we are properly to understand what happened, to thereby learn from mistakes and make sure no such things happen again in the future. My next guest tonight is Stephen Miller, broadcaster and commentator, who says the condition of his own mum, a care home resident, deteriorated severely because of the COVID policies. Good evening, Stephen. Hello.
Hi, Neil. Good to join you.
Thanks for being here. Tell me about your mum and what you saw happen to her.
Reliving this whole experience today as I was preparing for this interview was quite, it brings all the emotion back. And usually I'm a very forthright individual, as many people know. So what I did a timeline. I had to do it so I could recall it. And in 2019, my mum went into a care home with mid-stage dementia, and we visited every single day. As a family, we're very close, and we wanted to see my mum. Then the pandemic hit, and it was suddenly locked down. So we were completely cut off. The care home, who were great at the time, actually, they were terrified. They were absolutely terrified, as were the staff. So my mum had gone from this contact with her family, and who she still at that time knew, to suddenly no contact at all. So she was becoming starved of any contact, emotionally starved of any contact with me, my sister and my dad. Now, as time went on, of course, then we had that time where it was, you know, if you need to go into a care home, we'll still admit you into a care home, and the testing weren't being done and whatever. And at that point, I freely say that I had a mini breakdown. I mean, it just affected me so badly. The good news for me, though, I was one of the lucky ones, because the care home director was very responsible and decided no admissions. So no further admissions. He didn't allow any further admissions from March until August. So I was lucky. But during that time, as hard as the care home staff and the carers worked, my mum was denied access to her family. And I would see photos and I would look at her and I'd think, she's fading here. And it was just horrendous to see. She was losing weight. The face, I could just see it. She was just fading away. And I thought, you know what? My mum could die and I'm not going to be able to say goodbye to her. It was horrendous. Then, of course, what happened along this journey, I was very lucky because my partner took over and the care, I was one of the lucky ones. I say this because a lot of care homes did not act responsibly either, but my mum's care home did. So what happened was it was agreed that my partner would call the care home every single day and they would give my partner an update, and they were diamonds in the way they did that. It really saved me. At that time, what I decided to do, I had a fight back. I thought, this is wrong. This is wrong. And I had a fight back and set up my own mini campaign. And it was kind of like very therapeutic for me. And then I started to hear from other families and some of the stories that were just horrendous. And to fast track a little bit, even when the residents in some care homes were jabbed and the PPE was available and the testing was available, even then it weren't good enough for some care homes. So you had families that were sort of saying, look, I've done everything. I've been jabbed. I've had a test. I'm clear. I'll wear the PPE and all of that sort of stuff.
What about Stephen? What about, say, things as simple as vitamin D? Which we've always known boosts health, boosts immune systems. What about sunlight? Was your mother able to be out in the? I don't know what the circumstances were of the care home, but was there any of that simple care going on?
When you're talking about the care home sector generally, or medicine generally, it's about keys and trolley. The medicine trolley rules. So when you're talking about sunlight, vitamin D, of course, you and I know that. That helps. And to be fair to my mum, when she could, they did take her out, but she was fading. My mum was fading, and she eventually became bedbound. But I was lucky. But one of the key things here that really annoys me is that Matt Hancock's so-called, going on telly and families will be reunited with their loved ones and all of this sort of stuff was absolute. Well, I can't say what I feel about it because it's not the watershed, but it was just nonsense. It wasn't happening right across the care sector. And as I say, I was one of the lucky ones, so I don't want to knock the care home my mum's in. But what happened, Neil, as well, was there were families that were breaking. They were breaking, their hearts were breaking. And because some families would question care homes, the care homes were threatening to evict the resident. So if a family was saying, I'm really concerned, look, I'm jabbed, I'm clear, I'll test, I'll wear whatever you want. No, still not good enough in many care homes. But then you've got Matt Hancock telling everybody, and Helen Waitley, right? Oh, yes, it's all great because everything's coming together now and people can go in and see their loved ones and we're bringing people together again. No, we were not.
Stephen, we kept being told that it was a fast-moving situation and that, and that therefore the system had to keep on changing its ideas and changing its regulations to suit. Do you buy that? And is that what you saw happening in the case of your specific care home?
Do I buy? Absolutely not. Let me repeat. If a family member is jabbed, they have tested negative, they're wearing PPE, and they still had to do a window visit. What we did in this country, in many parts of the care system, we emotionally starved our elderly. That's what happened. And when people are living with dementia, that contact with their family is essential. And care homes were terrified. I'm not into blaming the care homes here, because they were terrified. What Matt Hancock and Helen Whately did not do, in my opinion, was be more bold. And all he needed to say was, if a relative is negative, they're jabbed, they're wearing PPE, they go through the door, they hold their hand of their loved one. And that's what he should have done. And that's what Helen Whately should have done as well. They didn't. They failed us. And they failed thousands of people, thousands of care home residents, sadly, many of whom died not of COVID. They died of a broken heart. They died of emotional starvation. They were losing weight. They were becoming ill. They're becoming frail. The photos that I've seen, it's heartbreaking. And unfortunately, I will never, ever be able to forgive Matt Hancock and Helen Whately for that.
Stephen, bear with me. I've got Kerry Dingle in the studio here. We'd like to ask you a question herself.
Steve, I'm very sympathetic to your experience, which is obviously true for very, very many people. But I wonder, do you think, I mean, obviously we've seen with the WhatsApp messages, you know, Hancock, etc., drunk on the tyranny of power and authoritarianism. But do you think there's a broader culture of ageism that is problematic here? And in your view, how have we come to a situation where care homes, which is supposed to be a home where you get extra care because people can't manage with a family member, for example, why have they become places you go and die?
Well, you're absolutely right. A care home should not be God's waiting room. It shouldn't just be seen as that. And coming back to Matt Hancock and Helen Whately, they just failed families. Why? I don't know. Maybe the power went to their heads and maybe they were terrified as well. But the one thing I resent massively is, well, there's many things, but the one thing I resent with Matt Hancock and Helen Whately is all of this kind of, we're bringing families and reuniting them with their loved ones into care homes again. It was absolute codswallop. That was not happening. And when poor families were begging care homes, they were begging care homes to go in and see their loved one because they thought they could. Now they had the jab, they tested negative and all of that. Some care homes out there were threatening to evict, i.e. throw out their loved one. Throw out their loved one. Shame on them as well.
Broadcaster and commentator Stephen Miller, it's heartfelt, passionate testimony, and I'm sure what you're saying tonight will resonate in thousands and thousands of homes up and down the country. Thank you so much for your time. We've been in touch with Care England, who said nobody was available for interview but sent us the following statement. Care homes were on the front line of the COVID pandemic, and tragically thousands of people died without their relatives and loved ones being able to be with them at the end of their lives. Care homes were required by law to lock down, and they did this reluctantly, but in order to protect the vulnerable people they support. Tom, how do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I've got a lot of empathy with that from the point of view of what we do know about COVID is that the most vulnerable group, the average age of a COVID death was, I think, 82.4
although most of those survived.
Years old.
Most of those got better as well.
Most of them did survive, but the point is this was a very vulnerable group, and actually when the inquiry does eventually get underway, I hope it really focuses on actually what happened around the whole PPE scandal, the fact that we had people being released from hospital into care homes. But I'll just say this, Neil, because I do think something that's not come up in this important discussion so far. At the time, the polling showed that the public were behind arguably stricter lockdowns. We've just had a poll that's come out from YouGov, which has actually said that about a third, in hindsight, think we weren't strict enough with lockdowns. So you've got to ask this question, were the politicians to some extent just following the polls as opposed to leading on that important issue?
Another break is upon us. It's always time we're chasing here. After that, we'll be discussing the drugs used in the very early stages of the pandemic. Don't go anywhere.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. We're talking about COVID again, and for me one of the crucial questions was just how were people treated in care homes and elsewhere? What were they treated with? Doctors around the world wanted to talk about the positive effects they'd seen with cheap available drugs, including but not limited to ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Joining me now to tell his own story is Dr. Edmund Fordham, physicist and engineer. Good evening, Edmund. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Neil. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Now, as someone who had survived cancer, what was your feeling when COVID arrived on the scene? What was your gut reaction?
Well, you know, Neil, when it first hit, I took most of the stuff that we were being fed in the media at face value, more or less. And I said to myself, hey, I'm supposed to be a vulnerable person here. I'm male. I'm the wrong side of 65. I'm the survivor of a major immune system cancer. What on earth do I do if I actually get this thing? And it wasn't very long, however, before I discovered that there was an awful lot that I could do. And, you know, looking after my own immune health, the support with vitamins, zinc and so on. And very quickly, I turned up some of the early work on hydroxychloroquine. And I said, well, okay, you know, there's a whole load of stuff I can do. I don't really need to be that scared of it. Why aren't we using these things? So that was my initial reaction.
Because my feeling about all of that was that because those drugs like ivermectin and like hydroxychloroquine had proven track records of safety, that for many people, if they wanted to take them, perhaps the worst that might happen would be that they would get no beneficial effect, but no harm. So I could not understand why people weren't simply given the option to give it a try. You know, at that point when supposedly we didn't know enough and we were floundering in the dark, you know, you use whatever tools are available.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that, Neil. And that was what I assumed. You know, hey, it might not work, but you're not going to come to any harm if it's a proven to be safe medicine. And instead, what we did was the opposite. Somewhere on .gov, there was, you know, a notice that said, oh, hydroxychloroquine must not be used except in clinical trials. And we had even junior doctors were wheeled on to the BBC to say that this was a dangerous medicine and it was highly toxic, and you know you've got to be very careful about it. Now, one bit about my background is that I was brought up in Eastern Africa, and I first took chloroquine, the older variant of hydroxychloroquine, I think at the age of 8 years old, as an anti-malarial prophylactic. So this was a medicine that was dished out routinely to children, and then we had doctors on the BBC saying it was a dangerous and toxic drug. Rubbish. This was complete nonsense. So there was obviously a lot of bluntly propaganda that was going on behind this, and that got me worried. There was a lot of fuss made with hydroxychloroquine about the so-called QT problem, and QT is basically the interval between one part of an electrocardiogram and another. It's the length of the heartbeat, and it does tend to lengthen the heartbeat. And of course, if you've got some complicated heart condition, then it might be contraindicated for you, but your doctor would know about that. The safety issues around hydroxychloroquine, I thought, were massively overblown. But I did shift my own attention later on to ivermectin, because I could see that hydroxychloroquine, at least in the UK, was politically tainted in a way that was not going to lead to its mainstream acceptance. So, and ivermectin, of course, is an even safer drug with an absolutely, you know, stellar safety record over literally billions of doses, billions, not millions, billions. And so, you know, you look these things up in the WHO's pharmacovigilance database, and it's very, very safe. So let's not argue about the quantitative metrics of how effective it is. Why on earth aren't we giving patients the opportunity to access these medicines?
That's the question. I'm very pushed for time tonight, Dr. Edmund Fordham, physicist and engineer, but thank you very much for that vital insight into your own personal experience. Thank you for joining me. I should say there have now been large-scale trials of ivermectin. And I am obliged to read the following. A large randomised controlled trial published in October 2022 in the journal JAMA Network found no significant difference between patients treated with ivermectin and placebo, and was described by Yale medical professor Perry Wilson as the final nail in the coffin for ivermectin as a treatment for COVID. That's a statement that I am obliged to read out, as I say. Joining me next to continue the debate is Dr. Roland Salmon, former Director of Communicable Diseases for Public Health Wales. Good evening, Roland. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Neil.
Now, my previous guest mentioned ivermectin and other off-label drugs, hydroxychloroquine for COVID. What is your reaction to that?
I think we'd all hoped that both of these drugs would, if you like, represent magic bullets. As you point out, they're already licensed for other uses, and the safety record certainly of ivermectin was very good. Of hydroxychloroquine, I thought your previous guest was a bit optimistic, really, and I took it as an anti-malarial as well, and it tastes disgusting, and you have to have your eyes checked from time to time. However, leaving that aside, clinical trials have been conducted. That's the gold standard way of working out, actually, are these things going to work or not, or merely be an unwelcome diversion? And I think it's pretty clear, because it was in the recovery trial, that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. Never mind all the political noise around it. That was carried out, and it doesn't. So I think we have to say, unfortunately, that isn't the case. Bear in mind, that same trial had found that dexamethasone did work, so it seems to me being done in an open-minded fashion. Ivermectin, I think, is a bit more complicated. The earlier meta-analyses were quite promising, but as more and more data has been added to the meta-analysis, the effects have got less and less. Now, if we think of meta-analysis as a way of approaching these problems, This is always a bad sign. And indeed, it's when they were looking at cardiac rhythm drugs in the 1980s and finding things that they thought were wonderful cures were actually nothing of the sort and indeed dangerous, that this whole method came into use. So
I can readily.
Go on, Neil. You want to say something?
I can readily counter. You know, you say that the jury's back in and that ivermectin doesn't work. You know, I can readily counter that. Bear with me,
because the jury's still out on ivermectin, and I'd like to see what the principal trial comes up with, because that was the Oxford University organised one, which, as far as I know, hasn't reported.
I can counter. In March 2021, Satoshi Omura, who was one of the two scientists who came up with ivermectin, he's a Nobel Prize for Medicine winner. And in a statement in the Japanese Journal for Antibiotics in March 2021, he said that there were many tests that had absolutely demonstrated the efficacy of ivermectin in relation to treating COVID as an early treatment and a prophylaxis. He said it was based on 42 tests. And he said, this is the guy that invented the drug, that in such a comprehensive review, the chances of an error, i.e. the finding that ivermectin was effective, the chances of an error were 1 in 4 trillion. Now, you and I can fence for hours about contrasting and conflicting data. I would simply say that the question of whether or not ivermectin works is not settled, and that if we are to act as science dictates, which is with sceptical interrogation at all times, we have to remain open-minded until further notice, at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. I would say you're invoking the Japanese scientists as a bit like sort of my expert's bigger than your expert, so perhaps isn't a very data-driven way of looking at the problem, Neil, with all respect. But my own view about ivermectin is it's in the principal trial. That's being organised by the scientists at Oxford. It's global. We ought to see what that reports. As I say, it has an admirable safety record, and I would be delighted to find that it was effective. I think there's a couple of things perhaps to bear in mind here too. It may be effective in some measure. If it was a miracle drug, that would have showed up by now, because the work that has been done would have demonstrated very high measurable effects. And I think we perhaps ought to keep that at the back of our mind. So if we're waiting, we're probably not losing a lot by waiting.
There are credible tests from highly credentialed professionals that put the efficacy of ivermectin and others, but ivermectin specifically, anywhere between 50 and high 80% effective early treatment and prophylaxis. Times against me again. Former Director of Communicable Diseases for Public Health Wales, Dr. Roland Salmon, thank you so much for taking part this evening. Both of you, how do you feel listening to that, Kerry? You know, one person says, oh, it doesn't work, and then there's conflicting data that says quite the contrary. Where are we?
Well, I actually thought that the last doctor was... very honest and very clear. I mean, they both were, obviously. But the last one, the point about, for example, the principal trial, I mean, my only query would be, why hasn't the principal trial reported when it has on 3 of the other drugs that it's tested? But having said, so maybe, he's right, they're going to come out because they have... Over 42,000 have undertaken the ivermectin tests. So let's hope we find out efficacy one way or the other, which would be a good. I don't think there's a huge prejudice against this drug. I think we're over-endowing it with... I would say, don't get carried away that we've found a golden bullet.
Tom, do you not remember that the mere mention of the word ivermectin was verboten?
Of course.
And still is. Now, when Kerry says there was no prejudice against it, surely there was. And I refer you again to the fact that because it was beyond patent, it was $2 a course, $2 a treatment, compared to $3,000 a course for remdesivir. Isn't it obvious why Merck and the other pharmaceuticals were so keen to get ivermectin away from everybody's attention, put it out of reach?
Well, that's why we have the phrase big pharma. And again, I think we need to understand some of those forces. But as a layperson, I'm not a clinician. I think as a member of the public, you have to put some faith in these clinicians to go through these trials, to report these trials faithfully in the relevant medical journals, and for the policymakers to respond accordingly. I think it's difficult to ask the public to intervene in a debate that.
But a Nobel laureate scientist, one of the 2 that invented the drug, when he had nothing more financially to gain from it, was able to say that the kind of tests that had demonstrated the efficacy of ivermectin treating COVID-19, that the chances of error in the tests, the 42 tests that he was aware of, was 1 in 4 trillion. Now, I would say that that means that he has very strong scientific data to support the absolute efficacy of ivermectin.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be the first time Nobel Prize winners, think about economists, who disagree with each other. They have different hypotheses. I think actually the central point you raised there with the clinician was this issue about we should remain sceptical. Science isn't about the promotion of a monoculture, and really what perhaps should happen, maybe patients should be given the choice with the associated risks of the different treatments that are available.
Kerry, I'm going to have to get to a break because we're up against time again, so very quickly.
Very quickly, there are. My point about it not being necessarily prejudiced against ivermectin was, A, because there were 16 different trials that are referred to, 13 were accepted, 3 were said as dodgy, and there wasn't proven efficacy. There are now 7 drugs available on the NHS and in the community that are being used. I can't see why they ditch ivermectin just in favour of a super expensive one, unless you think it's all driven by the cash.
Going to have to go to the break. Loads more to come. See you in 2 minutes. Or maybe 3.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
It's almost 7 o'clock. This is Neil Oliver live on TV, online and DAB+ radio. Plenty more to come in the second hour of the show. But first, an update on the news with Aaron.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Come along to Neil Oliver Live on GB News TV and on radio. Tonight on the show, over a year on since the start of the Ukraine war, I'll be joined in the studio by members of the charity Hospitallers Ukraine Aid, who've so far sent over 80 emergency vehicles and over £500,000 in medical aid to the war-torn country. We'll catch up with a 67-year-old shopkeeper who locked a shoplifter in his store only to be told by police to release the crook or face prosecution. We'll find out how a naughty spaniel, rejected by 8 different homes, managed to land himself a job saving lives. He's now one of the most successful medical detection dogs in Britain. All of that and more coming up, but first an update on the latest news from Aaron Armstrong.
Very good evening to you. Let's get you up to date with the latest from the GB newsroom. The Duke of Sussex says some British soldiers were not necessarily supportive of military efforts in Afghanistan. In a live-streamed interview with trauma therapist Dr. Gabor Mate, Prince Harry says he didn't align with the West during the conflict. In his memoir, the Duke of Sussex described killing 25 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan as chess pieces taken off the board.
One of the reasons why certainly so many people in the United Kingdom were not supportive of our troops was because they assumed that everybody that was serving was for the war.
Yeah.
But no, once you sign up, you do what you're told to do.
Yeah,
so there was a lot of us that didn't necessarily agree or disagree, but you were doing what you were trained to do. You were doing what you were sent to do.
New messages involving Matt Hancock reveal how the former health secretary battled to save his job after footage of him embracing colleague Gina Colin-D'Angelo emerged during lockdown. A string of messages published in the Daily Telegraph illustrate how Hancock tried to find exceptions to the rules to justify his behaviour. Hancock initially wanted to claim no rules were broken, then decided to apologise for breaking lockdown guidance, before finally tendering his resignation 2 days later. Boris Johnson may be facing a fight to save his political career following the findings of a report into Partygate. The Commons Privileges Committee say there's significant new evidence that Johnson misled MPs over lockdown parties on several occasions, and it would have been obvious to him and his colleagues they were breaking the rules. Mr Johnson says it was his belief all guidance had been followed. New powers to crack down on small boats crossing the Channel are expected to be announced by the government next week. The legislation is expected to make asylum claims inadmissible from those who travel to the UK on small boats. The Home Office would then be required to remove those migrants to Rwanda or a safe third country, and they'd be banned from returning to the UK. The number of people killed by a Russian strike in the southern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia has risen to 11. Emergency services there say they recovered a woman's body in the debris this morning. A child was amongst those killed in Thursday's strike on the 5-storey residential building. The UK is in for a cold snap next week, with temperatures expected to drop below freezing. Monday and Tuesday will see lows of -3 in Scotland, -2 in the northwest and east of England. Yellow weather warnings will be in place for snow and ice from early on Monday to late on Tuesday. That's across northern Scotland and northeast England. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now, it's back to Neil Oliver Live.
And yet another welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. My Great Britain tonight has a story to tell of love and loss, and also of perseverance and hope. I would say we always need to be reminded of light in the darkness, and Carolyn Mailing is undoubtedly worth listening to with that in mind. Carolyn joins me now. Thanks for coming, Carolyn.
Delighted to be here.
Tell me about your daughter, Rosie.
My daughter, she was funny, she was clever, she was bright, she was talented, and we had a pretty much perfect life, really. When she was 11, and we had an older sister as well, who was 14, and when she was 11, she was actually rehearsing a pantomime. She was a young performer. We run a theatre school in Maidenhead, and she got suddenly very sick. She was just rehearsing panto, and she had to come off the show. It just kind of manifested itself like a chest infection, and then it took hold, and it didn't get better. And then eventually, she came off the show, and she was diagnosed eventually after several months with vasculitis.
So how long then was the process of what happened next?
The process of what happened next. So from the time that she started getting ill, it was about 3.5, 4 months. And then eventually she had a CT scan, and she was told, or we were told, that we had to get her up to Oxford very, very quickly, blue lighted, because she had pulmonary embolisms on the arteries going into her lungs. So she was up at Oxford, and from being a perfectly normal child who'd never been ill in her life, we were suddenly kind of thrust into this hospital environment with a lot of very sick children, and we didn't know what was happening.
It's, as you describe, a perfect life that went before. How do you cope when you're suddenly a trap door opens and you fall into a completely different reality?
We were sort of in this very strange space. It was like normal life kind of existed outside the hospital walls, and we were kind of living this kind of. It was like an existence measured by medical procedures, really, and we were just kind of coping day to day during the hospital time. And then we were told that Rosie would have to have an operation to see what was going on. We thought it might be cancer. It turned out it wasn't. And so we were kind of rejoicing, but then they said, well, it's not cancer, it's blood clot. And we were thinking, thank God for that, it's just blood clot, they can get it out. But within 2 days, the blood clots came back. And then they started to wonder what on earth was going on. And that was when they actually discovered that she had vasculitis, which is an autoimmune disease, which affected her blood vessels.
And then things took the ultimate turn for the worse.
Yeah, so she was in hospital a long time, and she was eventually discharged, heavily medicated, but desperate to get back to school. She was a young performer, she was desperate to get back to her friends. She went home for 6 days. She wasn't well. And then one morning she got up and she went, I'm just going downstairs, I'm going to play on the computer. And we heard her coughing, and then suddenly she went, Mummy, I'm coughing up blood. And we basically rushed her up to the John Radcliffe at Oxford. She had a cardiac arrest, she had a pulmonary hemorrhage, and she went straight into intensive care, spent 9 days on a ventilator. And then gradually over the 9 days, they lost hope, and they said that she was brainstem dead, and we had to turn the machine off.
How on earth did you move through that quagmire that you then found yourselves in?
So that's myself and my ex-husband. We went home. We were kind of sent off. There was no kind of proper support at that time for parents like us. So we were kind of sent off with a pile of papers saying how to register the death of a child, sent back home and went, now what? My husband had a heart attack 2 days after Rosie died from the stress of the last few months. And then we were in this horrendous sort of void. He came out of it. We got through the funeral. And then we went, now what? I said something good has to come out of this. So, in fact, on the afternoon of her funeral, we had a celebration of her life. We've got a theatre over in Ascot. We had a celebration of her life, and all her friends were there reading poems and so on.
And you felt almost right away this in the book that you've written about this. You know, the future is Rosie, and you felt a spiritual connection to Rosie.
Completely, yeah. So Rosie loved coloured stripes. She was a very kind of vivacious, vivid sort of child, and she loved to wear rainbow stripes. And on the afternoon of this celebration, I said to a friend, I was standing by the theatre, I said, we've got to do something that so that her life wasn't for nothing. And I looked up outside the theatre, and there was this huge double rainbow over the top of the theatre, and I said, that's it, it's Rosie's Rainbow. So we set up Rosie's Rainbow Fund, which is a charity which provides music therapy for very sick children in hospital.
But you felt, did you not, that there was a message from Rosie about what should come next?
About what after that?
Yes.
Yes. So we had this awful void in our lives, and we didn't know what to do. And then one day I heard her voice in my head, and I saw this picture of a baby. And I heard her voice going, you can do this, Mummy, you can do this, go and do it. And this picture of this baby wouldn't go away. And I thought, I've got to have another baby. It wasn't to replace Rosie, because nothing could replace our child, who was actually adored by everybody. But we thought, a life is better than no life. And actually, if we can have something that will give us a future, then we need to try and go down this route. But I was very old at the time.
And the solution that presented itself was?
So the solution that presented itself was IVF. So we went down the IVF route, although I was nearly 50. So we actually did two cycles with my sister's eggs, which actually didn't work. And then I turned 50. And but I kind of knew that it was going to happen. I just felt it was preordained. And so I had to keep going, and then eventually found a clinic in Harley Street that would treat women over 50. So I said, right, we'll do that then. So the clinic said, yes, we can do this, but there's a 3-year waiting list, or you can go to Cyprus. So I said, all right, we'll do that then. so we found an egg donor who was actually from Moldova, had the treatment in London, flew out to Cyprus, which was their sister hospital from this London clinic, and had the embryo transfer. And the guy who was doing the transfer said, this is going to work. And I went, don't say that after this roller coaster. We'd had 5 years of like hell. And he said, no, I think this is going to work. And lo and behold, he said, go home, do a pregnancy test in 9 days, and I was pregnant.
And now, who do you have in your life?
So now I have this gorgeous little boy. Well, not little now anymore. He's called Dominic. He was born when I was 54, and he is amazing. He's 14 now, and he's taller than me. He's 6 foot.
Extraordinary. Looking at a picture
There
there
he
on the
is.
screen.
There he is.
You've written about this, the books. I'm frightened to read books like this because of the unthinkable that's there, the unthinkable that's between the pages. But there's also so much more as well.
There is.
What is your message to the world?
Well, in my book, I've kind of tried to make it like an inspiring message so that people don't give up, so that they, so that despite the devastating trauma, whatever happens to them, you can actually achieve something that actually is going to give you a future. And
that is quite a story, Kerry, is it not?
It's certainly, it's pretty traumatic, but I love the optimism and the hope that you end up with. And it's so great that older women can have babies, actually, and not just older blokes.
Yeah, it's all in the book.
Tom, you and I sit with Great Britons.
We do.
Many times. And they're all different, but that story of the possibility of hope out of darkness is always uplifting.
And of course, we're both fathers as well. I mean, I'll be celebrating actually my daughter's 13th birthday, so it's just unimaginable, even the thought of losing a child. And, Karen, I was listening to you there and you're holding your book, and I will have a look at that later. I didn't detect any bitterness in what you were describing. You didn't, for example, say that perhaps the clinicians could have done more to save Rosie. I sense that, you've obviously been on a journey sort of processing that trauma, but you've turned that trauma into something positive. Dominic, obviously a beautiful teenager, he's just a few years younger than my eldest teenage son. So it's just a fantastic story. And, when we talk about Great Britons here, what really makes them great, I think, is that positivity, that sense of whatever's happened in your life, you don't have to become the victim. You can move forward.
Thank you for that, Tom. But we're running out of time. I could listen to so much more of this, but author and founder of Rosie's Rainbow Fund, Carolyn Mayling, thank you so much. You're definitely a Great Britain. You embody the spirit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll meet two members of the charity Hospitallers Ukraine Aid, who so far sent over 80 emergency vehicles and over £500,000 in medical aid to the war-torn country.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. For more than a year now, soldiers and civilians have been dying in Ukraine. People from all walks of life and all around the world have been moved and motivated to get involved, offering any help they can. My next guests set up a charity to swiftly provide medical aid, particularly ambulances and other emergency vehicles. Justin Hughes, an ex-RAF and biotech CEO, and Alex Podoprigora, I hope I pronounced that adequately, founder of Hospitallers Ukraine Aid, join me now. Welcome both.
Welcome.
Tell me about the charity Hospitallers and what it does.
Charity Hospitals, it's volunteers, civil people from all walks of life in Ukraine who have joined together to provide medical assistance on the front lines in Ukraine. At the moment, we have over 600 volunteers who operate across the whole front line, starting from the north, east, and south.
In the midst of a war situation, with so much happening, so many moving parts and so much help need, how did you go about pinpointing what help it was you felt was required and that you might be in a position to help provide?
I mean, when the war started, like myself, because I'm Ukrainian originally, but I live in the UK for I have lived in the UK for quite a long time. When the war started, I was in complete shock, like many other people, and I started to think, how can I best help and support my country? And we started to look for supporting various organizations. And I did a little bit of research on Ukraine. And then I came across this group of volunteer paramedics. It's a civil people of civil professions, any profession you can think of, different ages, different backgrounds, who came together to undergo very, very short first aid training, so they can go on the front lines and start saving lives of people, civilians, soldiers, you name it. And then the main challenge for those people was funding, because those people are not part of the government, they're not part of the army, they're just like you and me and Justin coming together, jumping in the car and driving away. And they had a lot of challenge in finding money, but not only money, finding aid equipment, medical equipment, and cars in particular. And this is why I thought, okay, instead of like trying to help, I'll just start focusing on the particular task.
Justin, how did you two know each other? How did you come to be together in this endeavour?
So we were at business school together quite a long time ago now. And I hadn't spoken to Alex for quite a while. And after all this started, I rang him up to check in with him and just sort of say, how's your family? Is there anything I can do? What's going on? And he was telling me, he'd already started to send these ambulances and vehicles. And I said, can I do anything? And he said, well, we're okay and we've got drivers and that. And then he sort of randomly said, the only real problem we have is the ambulances, because you need to have a C1 on your licence. So while I'm talking to him on the phone, I sort of got my wallet out. I'm looking at my licence. I'm like, well, I've got a C1. And he's like, yeah, that's because you're British and you're really old. And, they used to give that away for free in the driving test. And he said, I said, well, can I help you? And he said, well, would you like to drive in ambulance? He said, we could go either tomorrow or Friday.
Wow.
And I was sort of like, yeah, I probably should just speak to my wife first. But she was hugely supportive. And so we did it.
So you went from your life to driving an ambulance in a war zone?
No, because the idea was to drive it to Ukraine.
and literally just drop it off just over the wire. And Alex had done, lots of these convoys. It was the first time for me.
Get it into the country.
Yeah, as it turned out, we dropped them off in Poland, and we got this message about meeting these guys in this sort of random car park outside Warsaw. And it's funny, we pitched up there, and this group of guys look like a bunch of heavies, to be honest. And I was like, this could be interesting. And I opened the door, and the guy comes out and gives me a big hug and said, "Thank you for bringing the kit." And I said to him, "Are you Polish? We're in Poland." And he said, "No, I'm Ukrainian, but I have to live here now." And he pulled up his trouser leg, and up to then, all friends were like, "Oh my God, you've done this amazing thing." The reality is, for me, it was kind of just a road trip across Europe. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't that big a deal. It was almost a bit of an adventure. But then he pulled up his trouser leg and he had a prosthetic limb. And he's like, I got blown up. And it was that moment of realisation. And then one thing led to another. And, in order to sort of provide longevity, Alex was talking about the charity at that point. And I didn't really say it to him, but I was a bit like, this is already swinging the way of Ukraine. I was like, we're not going to need this, it's not going to last long enough. But it has, and so over time we set up the charity.
And how many vehicles and the rest have you been able to provide there?
I mean, over 80.
It is 80.
Over 80.
Yeah. Can you tell me, Alex, what's it like for the people on the ground, the hospitallers who are actually there doing it? What kind of stories do they have to tell about what they're seeing and what's happening to them?
I mean, this is quite moving in their stories because, like as I said to you just a year ago, all of them were ordinary people, and none of them knew anything about, providing first aid as such. And then they had to undergo all this transformation within 2 weeks, because what happened was that they were sent for the very short training, 2-3 weeks, and after 3 weeks, you are on the front lines saving human lives, and then you can be like a 19, 20 years girl, who was just a student yesterday, and it's very, very sad stories very often because we do lose people because enemy targeting medical people a lot, and we have some tragic accidents as well because, for example, there are certain areas, and you've been talking about Bakhmut today, Avdiivka on the news. We have crews operating in those areas, and there are certain areas where you cannot evacuate an injured person during the daylight. You need to wait for the situation to get dark, and then when you evacuate person in the night, you can't put your lights on, so you have to drive your vehicle without lights, because if you drive your vehicle with the lights, you're an easy target. And we had unfortunate collisions where you would hit the tank because the tank would be crossing the road and so on. It's really.
Justin, how do you feel? Your life has been significantly altered by this, by re-establishing connection with Alex. What's the...
You just feel that, the actual practical commitment for me, it doesn't ask much of me in terms of time or anything. And it's just that...
But a door has opened into another.
Yeah, you just feel that there's a small opportunity to do something here that, I'm just a tiny part of in a much bigger picture, but to actually help to make a little bit of a difference and do something meaningful in a positive way. It's like when this first all started and people were, opening the doors for people to come and live with them and all. And obviously, we were just talking about before, all these things get normalised and, people, they lose that urgency. And so, you talk to Alex and his friends and family and people in Ukraine, they all think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And I guess the thing for us is we're able to deliver aid to the point of need directly, very quickly, in a very agile way, with no sort of central management or overhead or anything. So if we can carry on doing that, and it's almost like the Bob Geldof moment, we need to keep the money coming in.
What can people who are watching this, people who want to get involved, how can they help, practically or financially?
Because we have put together some website, hospitalers.org.uk, and there is information on that website. So some people bring donations in, so we have a collection point in London where we collect medical supplies, because we are looking after paramedics. We are focusing on the medical aid mostly. At the moment, our necessities are armored vehicles, because things are getting really, really bad. The fighting is really, really getting to the very, very next terrible stage. We used to use ordinary pickup cars to collect, just to give you a little bit of background how the evacuation takes place. So we have pickup cars which drive to the front line, collect injured person and drive away maybe 10, 15 miles maximum, where the bigger ambulance is waiting. So we move injured person to the bigger ambulances, and depending on the condition, we may need to stabilize this person. If it's okay to drive this person further, we drive this person further to the field hospital. And then from the East Field Hospital, we have a special bus, medical bus, which can take up to the 6 very, very heavy injured people inland to the proper hospital. So it's a 3-stage process, and at the moment, our cars, our pickup cars, are not able to get through to the certain areas of the front line for 2 reasons. Because first of all, easy target, a lot of mines in Avdiivka area, in Uledar, or in Bakhmut. You know, the amount of shelling, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's much, much worse to what we had in the beginning of the war. And we always risk, our paramedics, civilian people risk their lives. And our main priority now, getting armored cars. At least we can protect them from being hit by mines or shelling.
You make it frighteningly real.
It's real.
You make it frighteningly real with your testimony. Alex Podpregora, Justin Hughes, wish you all the very best of luck with what you're doing. So important. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After the break, I'll be joined by the 67-year-old shopkeeper who locked a shoplifter in his store only to be told by police to release the crook or face prosecution himself. See you in 3 minutes.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, Boris Johnson's criticism of Rishi Sunak will achieve only one thing, a Labour government. In my take at 10, what a week for our heroic King Charles, who looks to have evicted both Harry and Meghan and Prince Andrew from their lavish royal homes. Charles is getting his house and all the royal houses in order. Our dynamic new monarch is hitting all the right notes with the British public. Plus, top US reporter Kinsey Schofield and tomorrow's Sunday papers with full panel reaction. See you at 8.
Hello again, lovely people. We all like to hear about have-a-go heroes, don't we? Stepping in to stop crime. But what happens when a have-a-go shopkeeper finds himself threatened with prosecution himself? That's exactly what happened to 67-year-old Jarnal Singh Atwal at his off-licence in Derby. Take a look at this CCTV footage. Watching someone moving along the aisles in the off-licence. Bag on shoulder. There we go. Item taken. And away. Jarnal Singh Atwal joins us now. Exactly what were we looking at there, sir? What was actually happening and what was your reaction?
As soon as Mr. rang me that somebody stole the stuff, I followed him, grabbed him outside the shop, brought him back in the shop, locked the door, phoned the police, told them everything on CCTV. If you can send somebody to arrest him, please. Police reactions. If I won't let him go, I will be arrested.
Now, what did the police say when you called them?
No, nobody came after. Nobody got in touch with me after at all. I had to let him go. Police orders. Since then, no reaction from police at all.
And what was the reaction of the customers in the shop when all of this? You know, because it wasn't just the two of you in the shop when this was happening.
I'm running shop for 30 years. They were the loyal customers. They stayed in to assist me, to help me, if he do anything to me. They even told him if he touched me, they put him down. So they weren't trapped in the shop. They were here to help me.
Do you feel that police now where you are more on the side of criminals than on the victims of crime, i.e. you?
You know, police should get in touch with me. They haven't.
Do you experience a lot of crime like this?
You know, it happened so many times in the past. In the past, police assistant was brilliant. I don't know what happened this time. I never expected that.
And are you concerned that this individual is out there, has had this experience with you, and, you know, presumably is at liberty to come back to the shop?
I never seen him before. That's the first time he came in the shop.
How has it changed? You know, you say you've been a shopkeeper there for 30 years. You know, what change in the community have you seen?
You know, my local customer, we are like family. They're so supportive, so good. Anybody stranger like that, we will keep the eye on them. It doesn't happen very often, but it do happen sometime.
But it must undermine your faith. You know, when ultimately, when you're a victim of this kind of criminality, you fall back on the police as a matter of course. And when you're handled in this way and made to feel like the villain yourself, your faith in it must be severely compromised.
The reaction I got is what police want to say. Any thieves, come in, help yourself. Nobody will touch you.
Tom Buick, how do you feel reacting to that? This is an everyman story in a sense. You know, Mr. Singh Atwal experiencing this, and this is how he was treated by the local constabulary?
Well, it's just this culture of impunity increasingly for these so-called low-level crimes. I mean, I've read accounts of police forces issuing guidance to their officers to not even go to the scene of a alleged shoplifting incident, and we saw it there. I mean, again, it's also this sort of sense that you can't even make a citizen's arrest anymore because there's all worry that somehow, in this case, you know, the assailant will turn on presumably the shopkeeper. I mean, you know, to give some credit perhaps to the police, maybe that's what the controller was worried about when the call went through, that somehow that could turn into a very violent situation. But it sounds to me that there's been no follow-up, and importantly, that person is out there thinking, well, that's potentially a soft touch in the future to go back to that store. And that, of course, gets around, doesn't it, amongst the criminal fraternity?
What does it say, Kerry, about the world that we're living in, that even a direct victim of a crime tries to tackle the situation himself and going for help to the police for help is turned away and told that if he doesn't let the criminal go, he'll be charged?
Well, unfortunately, I think we're seeing more and more of this, and I think we have to ask major questions. You know, he's basically being accused of potentially being a vigilante rather than seen as a hero, which he is. Yes, when I read the story earlier, there was a concern that this guy had threatened to burn the shop down. But as your man says, he had everyone there in the shop on his side, wholly supportive. The police did not even turn up and have not turned up since. So what is it they're so busy doing? You know, we have now these tyrannical, endless guidelines of the police, you know, during COVID, stopping parties, of arresting people, elderly people for something they've said on Twitter. They can't turn up to a real crime and then, you know, outrageously threaten to criminalise someone for taking matters into their own hands. I've always thought that the trust needs to be on us. We need to be trusted to deal with these situations because we will often deal with them better than the law. But at least you expect the law to be there to back you up.
Mr. Singh Atwal, if you're still there with me, has this changed the way that you'll handle this situation in the future? You know, what do you do? Because, you know, you say it doesn't happen so often, but you will no doubt be in this situation again. What do you do to protect your shop?
I'll do the same. What I've done, I'm not scared. I have to save my stock. I can't let everybody help themselves.
And are you getting any kind of reassurance from the police at all that they will, you know, that they will continue to look into this for you, or have they just washed their hands of it?
You think the only police station in the backyard of my shop, only walking distance. They're not far, only in the back of my shop. Why can't they call in? I can't understand.
Mr. Singh Atwal, it's a very depressing, very, you know, a story that just takes away the heart from local communities when they feel that they're left adrift in a situation like this. When there's crime, they expect to be able to turn to the police and can't. Thank you so much for bringing that to us, and I hope you have better luck with the clientele that pass through your shop in the future.
Thanks for highlighting that.
I have a spokesperson from Derbyshire Police, or a statement from same, which reads, the caller explained that the man was allegedly making threats to harm those inside by setting fire to the shop. Due to those threats and the risk that was posed to the other customers, the caller was told that the door should be unlocked. Since the incident, officers have spoken with the owner of the shop in order to request CCTV in order to try and identify the man involved.
It's just not good enough, though, is it, Neil? It really isn't. I mean, when you also read these stories about police officers going around to individuals who have tweeted something, and you comments like, we're here to check on your thinking, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. We know during the pandemic, we saw that actually with Derbyshire Police then, I do believe, with the drone footage, if you remember, that was just overlooking two individuals just taking a walk and checking them in terms of COVID restrictions. I mean, I do think we've got this layer now, haven't we, of these so-called democratically elected police commissioners. They need to be, frankly, doing a better job at holding our police to account, because when public confidence disappears like this in the system, then we've no longer got, the police are the public and the public are the police.
Coming up, we've got a break, after which, how did a naughty spaniel rejected by 8 different homes become one of the best detective noses in Britain? Find out in 3 minutes.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
Welcome back, everyone. We're on the last lap of this episode of Neil Oliver Live. And finally, this is Asher, the Cocker Spaniel. Asher was a rescue puppy and was so, naughty is the word I keep on being told about Asher. He was rejected by 8 different owners, and it looked like this could have been a very tragic ending. But the moment Dr. Claire Guest met the troublesome hound, she knew he was a keeper, and she was certainly right. She retrained Asher, and he is now a lifesaver. The 4-year-old dog has the ability to detect the smell of human diseases and to save lives. And Gemma from Medical Detection Dogs joins me now. Gemma, this is amazing. Thank you for joining me with this story. So tell me about Asher first of all. Why was he so hard to home? And do you think his basic nature was part of why he's so good at what he does?
I think you're absolutely right. He was deemed naughty, untrainable. He was just troubled. He hadn't quite found the right home. He needed to be busy. He needed to be challenged. You know, he wasn't happy just kind of sitting around doing nothing all day and relaxing like some dogs are. And he really landed on his paws when he came to medical detection dogs. He became a biodetection dog, which requires him to use his nose, answer questions, all in return for a treat. And he just absolutely loved it. And he's a completely different dog now. He was 4 years old when he joined us, and he's we think about 10 now, obviously, because he's a rescue dog. It's difficult to know for sure. And he's spent his career sniffing diseases, and his work will have the potential to save millions of lives.
How does this work? Talk me through the scenario. What is it that Asher actually, what are the scenarios and the situations that he actually walks in on 4 paws?
Well, our biodetection dogs work in our training room near Milton Keynes, and they learn the odour of a variety of different human diseases. So in Asher's case, he first of all started working on our malaria project. We've tested his nose on Parkinson's disease, and most recently he's been one of our COVID-19 detection dogs. Now, these dogs enter our training room and they're given a range of samples to sniff, one of which will contain the odour of a human disease. And when they find it and they alert us to it, some will stand there and stare at it, some will nudge it. When they make it really obvious that they found it, they get a treat. To them, it's a game. To us, it's teaching us all the time about the odour of human disease and leading us to a faster, more accurate and non-invasive diagnosis. And like I say, Asher does all of this for a biscuit or a tennis ball. It's a win-win situation for him.
And it's probably an impossible question, but is there any way of sort of conceptualising what the different diseases might smell like? Is it the case that the odour is just so imperceptible to us, but if it was magnified in some way, we would smell it too?
Potentially, yes. I mean, you know, we use different human samples for different diseases. So, for example, in the case of prostate cancer, it's urine samples. Some diseases, it's breath samples or sweat samples. You're absolutely right. You or I could smell these all day long and not have a clue which one has the disease in it. Just to put into some context how incredible dogs' noses are, they have 350 million scent receptors compared to humans who have about 5 million. They can smell the equivalent of a teaspoon of sugar in 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So their sense of smell is, you know, completely incomparable to ours. And we'll never know what they know unless we continue doing this sort of research and development and get closer all the time to figuring out how we can use the odour of disease to lead to early diagnosis of some of the, you know, the world's biggest killers.
Is there any way in which, you know, people have an untrained dog, you know, a dog that's not actually been trained to do this? You know, is there behaviour that people would recognise in their pet spaniel that might cause them to think that the dog is instinctively aware of something amiss?
Well, on the other side of our charity, we train medical alert assistance dogs. These are dogs that live with individuals that have complex health conditions such as type 1 diabetes or POTS or drop attacks or non-epileptic seizures. And we work very closely with clients to train dogs to be able to give them about a 5 to 10 minute warning when they're about to become seriously ill. Now, there have been cases where clients have come to us and said, I've got a pet dog who is actually showing signs of doing this already. And then we work with them to sort of formalise their training and make it easier for them and work on the public access with the dog and things like that. So there's been anecdotal evidence to show that dogs can detect diseases without any training for many years. In fact, our charity was founded shortly after our CEO, Claire Guest, her own dog warned her that she had a very deep-seated breast cancer. So absolutely, you know, all dogs have got the potential to do this. One of the questions we get asked the most often is which dogs can do it? Is it only Labradors? Is it only Spaniels? Because those are the kind of dogs that you most often see doing this detection work. But actually, we would usually say, although it is often gun dog breeds, it's any dog that wants to chase that tennis ball 100 times and isn't bored, wants to work, wants to please their owner, you know, has that sort of fantastic bond. So, yeah, the possibility of a dog's nose is endless.
Bear with me, Gemma. Kerry, does that not blow your mind? That there's among, as well as being guide dogs for the blind and you know, detection at airports of illicit substances and explosives, that dogs can actually go out there and detect the scent of illness.
I think it's absolutely fun. I have heard about it before. I think it's brilliant. I think the work of the charity is brilliant. I think what blows my mind is the idea that we've got 5 million scent sensors and dogs have got 350 million. And you kind of think, it must be really smelly if we had a dog come into our place then.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it, Tom? You know, or it opens your eyes to the idea of what other species live in. You know, we live in a world of visual stimulus, but a dog, when it's out and about, is living in a world of scent.
Absolutely, we've got our 5 senses, but I mean, it's just mind-blowing, as you say there, what Gemma was describing. But actually, a question I had for her, if she's still online, was just whether or not working dogs can also be pet dogs, or whether you have to have a clear separation between the two.
That's a good question, Gemma. Did you hear that? Is a working dog also a pet, or are they strictly professionals?
I mean, first and foremost, they are working dogs. They are trained to be working dogs. But in the case of a dog like Asher, for example, he comes into our training room, he puts his red jacket on, he knows he's working. He's in a work environment, he's with his trainer, he knows exactly what he's in there to do. I see Asher, when he's finished his session in the training room, upside down on the sofa in Claire's office all the time, having his belly rubbed and rolling around on the carpet. So they absolutely, lead the life almost of sort of very important pets when they're not at work. But no, first and foremost, they are working dogs. But I'm really glad you asked that, because, the sort of the health and welfare of these dogs is obviously really important. And they absolutely have their free runs, their time at home. Of course, they're absolutely adored by their clients, as you would imagine. But when they put their red jacket on, they know there's something special. They know they're VIPs, and they know that when they do what they're asked to do, they'll get a treat and a reward.
Do you know what it makes me think, Gemma? 30,000 years or so ago, perhaps, we had our relationship established with dogs, and how right we were to establish that kind of man's best friend relationship with canines, because look at the things they've been able to do for us.
Yeah, if they're treated correctly and they're given the love and the respect that they deserve, as I say, they look up, they can save our life. It's as simple as that, and they do save the lives of our clients every single day. And they don't know how special they are. That's what's so fantastic about Asher's got absolutely no idea that he can detect 3 horrendous diseases, which is something that medical science can't do yet.
Excellent. Gemma Butland from Medical Detection Dogs, thank you so much for telling us about the wonderful Asher. That's all from me on Neil Oliver Live tonight. My thanks as always to my panel, Kerry Dingle and Tom Buick, and I'll be back at 6 o'clock next Saturday. Next up, it's Mark Dolan tonight. Mark, tell us what's in store.
Neil, what another brilliant and fantastic unmissable show. Well, we'll do the same for the next 3 hours. We kick off with the People's Hour, in which I'm taking your video calls. Also, in my big opinion, why Boris Johnson's antics risk guaranteeing a Labour government. Be careful what you wish for. And in my take at 10, Harry and Meghan and Prince Andrew evicted from their royal residences. It's been a great week for King Charles. See you shortly.
Hello there, I'm Craig Snell, and here is your latest forecast on the Met Office. Well, as we go through the next few days, it's set to turn much colder across the UK, with some of us seeing some snow and ice at times. Out there at the moment, though, we've still got this area of high pressure keeping things relatively settled across the UK. This weather front will just be a focus of some showers as we end